The whole premise of our drug supply is that so long as the FDA has approved it, it is safe to take. And there is very little questioning of that basic premise. So nobody downstream is testing drugs, right? It's FDA approved, so it's all okay. But in fact, what you find when you really dig in is that there is a vast quality difference between different manufacturers, and that, not all generic drugs are alike. Not all drugs are alike. But, as one of my sources said, as a consumer, if you go out to buy cheddar cheese, you know the difference between Cheese Whiz, Kraft, and artisanal cheddar, right? Everybody gets that. And you understand that you get what you pay for. But if you go to CVS or let's say you go to Walmart and you pay $4 for a refill of a prescription, what you don't really understand as a consumer is that Walmart is, contracting with some of the lowest cost manufacturers, and you're getting essentially, rock bottom quality in that drug.
All right, Katherine. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's great to be with you. I've had your book here, Bottle of Lies, for a number of months now, and the amount of research that you spent that went into this, I mean, it's just amazing. I'm sure we're going to dive into a lot of the details, and so I just want to commend you for your work. But what inspired me to reach out and to have this discussion was I was very curious, with these vaccines coming out and the amount of doses that they need to make. I was interested about, because I've been in the supplement space in manufacturing since 2006, and it's great when your sales increase, but sometimes it's hard to meet that demand. And when we're sending out millions and potentially hundreds of millions or billions of dosages, I was like, okay, well, where are these things going to be made? Are they made in the US? And then you had this great article in Vox magazine, and I was like, I got to reach out and so forth. So, or at least you were interviewed for that article. So, thank you for your work. And just for listeners, you've been investigating the pharmaceutical industry, getting messages, working with industry whistleblowers for about 20 years. Is that right?
That is correct. Yep.
And it started out, I don't know all the history, all the details, but you were a journalist for the New York Times. And I heard on, I think it was STEM Talk, that you actually survived the South Tower during 9/11. You were inside that?
Yeah, well, actually, so on that day, and not to take too long a detour, but I was on the Metro desk of the Times. I went down, once we found out that these planes had struck the towers and still didn't know why or by whom. I went down to what became Ground Zero, and I was interviewing people as they were exiting from the North Tower when the South Tower fell, and was almost buried alive. Ran for my life, and ended up spending the next 40 hours down at Ground Zero reporting for the Times. Very, very intense period of time. But at that time I was working, then I went and worked on the investigations desk of the New York Times, and we were tracking all the hijackers. Ultimately, I ended up leaving the Times and have since focused on medical and pharmaceutical reporting. And this Bottle of Lies is my second book, and I spent 10 years on it.
Man.
10 years reporting that book.
I know we're going to get into the weeds on this, and I'm really excited about that. But I just have a curious question here. Were you ever intimidated or threatened or censored? Because now I'm sure you're familiar with all the censorship of big tech companies and Instagram and Google and YouTube and all of this. Were you ever kind of ostracized from the journalist community by talking about potential problems in stemming from the pharmaceutical industry and or FDA?
I got a tremendous amount of support from the journalistic community for my reporting on Bottle of Lies. And in fact, there was a terrific journalist organization, Global Investigative Journalism Network, that helped me hook up with journalists in countries where I did reporting, who I ended up hiring in Africa, in India, in China, Um, so they were enormously helpful. Um, I did receive multiple sort of threats and legal threats from the industry who did not want to see this book come out. So that was a difficult challenge. I wouldn't describe that as censorship so much as the kind of battle that goes on when you are exposing things about a powerful industry. But that is sort of par for the course as an investigative journalist, and how you know that you're telling a story that needs to be told. It's a clue, as we would say.
Let me just extrapolate from that. So the censorship is, and the backlash is a hint that you're getting at the truth that people would rather, the public not know about.
Well, I wouldn't use the word censorship
Okay.
because, I mean, to me, that is a government function.
Mm-hmm.
But I got precious little cooperation from the FDA, and I got a lot of legal threats from the generic drug industry in the process of bringing out this book.
Which is a wonderful book. So let's just paint a hypothetical scenario. It seems like prescription drugs are a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they offer a lower cost alternative to the patented medication, which seems helpful, especially for people that don't have a lot of resources or third world countries. But on the flip side, the quality control measures are just not the same compared to the so-called patent drug. So maybe if we just want to give just a 50,000 foot view of the landscape of the picture about when a drug goes off patent, what that sort of means, and then what that also means in terms of quality control measures and how those can go to the wayside potentially.
Sure. So, when brand name companies, which are also called innovator companies, when they develop a new drug, they have a certain number of years that drug is protected under patent. When that drug is close to expiry, two things can happen. A generic company can challenge the patent in a court to try to bring out a lower cost version sooner, or they can wait for the patent to expire. And then under the FDA's rules, if they are approved, they are allowed to bring out a generic version that is deemed bioequivalent, which means that essentially it's going to function in the body the same way that the brand name drug does. And the FDA imposes a formula that is the basis of approval, a way to measure bioequivalence, which is just, it has to be roughly absorbed into the bloodstream with the equivalent amount that a brand name is, but it has to be the same molecule. The problem is, the brand name companies don't just turn over their recipe. It's not like there's some written down recipe that's recorded and then peacefully handed over. The brand name companies are trying to protect their patent for as long as they can. So the generic companies have to reverse engineer the drug. They take brand name samples, they break it down in a lab. They try to figure out how to remake it with fewer steps to make it cheaper. They have to create, if it has a time release mechanism, they have to create that. And then they bring it, if it's approved by the FDA, they can bring it to market. So that is sort of the scenario if everything goes according to plan. But what my investigative reporting showed is there is a tremendous amount of fraud behind the scenes that leads the resulting generic to be, in fact, quite different than the brand name drug.
Wow. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but it seems like even if you're a very skilled chemist, to reverse engineer with no blueprint and then forget time released or phased delivery system by physically, all of that. I mean, it seems like that would be challenging. And then to do that with maybe without residual, benzene and toluene and other caustic agents, for example, to make the same cleanliness. Is there any benefits? So let's say, we'll just create a pharmaceutical company X. We go off patent, and then it gets, we get approval through the FDA, and someone else is able to reverse engineer. Do we get licensing as pharmaceutical company X? Do we get any residual royalties from the sales of that? Like, would there be any incentive for us to tell them anything, or are we just completely done once it's off patent?
You mean the brand companies?
Yes.
Well, brand companies can strike deals with generic companies, and in some cases, they even release what's called an authorized generic, which is you can use our recipe. It's basically the same identical drug, but you're going to market it, you're going to label it, you're going to make it, but you're going to do it to our specifications. So that's a scenario where a brand company sort of stays in the game. Um, but more often, situation is that a generic company is going to try to make a version. They're going to try to get the FDA to approve it. The problem is, the financial structure of the industry, the price plunges to the extent that there is no longer an incentive for quality, right? I mean, if you are making a drug and selling it for pennies on the dollar, what is the incentive to make it really well, really carefully? Then you couple that with the fact that the majority of generic drugs are made overseas, the majority in India or China, right? Far away from the FDA's watchful eye, in factories where basically the bottom line prevails. And that's when you really get into the kinds of very dangerous situations that I document in my book.
Mm. Yeah, I mean the laundry list of unscrupulous manufacturing practices. I mean it's pretty frightening, and you also got a thumb drive with 20,000 documents. We can talk about that were pretty surprising. But so is the crux of the problem that there's just not enough financial motivation? Do you think, due to the legislation set up? For the generic drugs, that the people doing it, the manufacturers offshore, are just not going to put the quality? Is that, I mean, if you could just wave a magic wand, would that help fix it?
Well, it's a complicated problem. One is a real failure of regulation. So in the US, when the FDA inspects a manufacturing plant, and they're basically required to roughly every 2 years, they show up unannounced and stay as long as is needed. But because of the complex logistics of inspecting a plant overseas, the FDA has decided to give those plants months of advance notice that they're coming. So these plants will literally, as I've exposed in the book, send in teams of data manipulators who will invent documents, backdate documents, and essentially create a sort of stage set of compliance. They will make it appear as though they are complying with FDA regulations, whereas in fact they really aren't. So that is a tremendous part of the problem.
Mm. And there was some manufacturing facilities in China where they were actually, there were staged facilities. So they would send the auditors to a facility, and it was just a big show, like a showroom where things weren't. That to me is just the level of dishonesty and corruption to go through those loopholes instead of just doing it right from the get-go is unbelievable.
Right. But, the FDA has sort of invited the companies in a way to commit this level of fraud because they're regulating on an honor system. They are taking data from the companies and reviewing the data. On the basis of that data, they approve drugs. And remarkably, and this really surprises people, they do not test drugs before they approve them, right? The whole idea is that the quality lies in the data. The data is a roadmap to the manufacturing process. It's a kind of minute by minute record of what happened while the drug was being manufactured, by which you can figure out what is the stability of the drug, what is the toxicity of the drug, what is the absorption into the bloodstream. The problem is, what if that data is fake? And very often it is. And in fact, when I was reporting this book, I went down to FDA headquarters and sat around with a group of officials there. And the head of the FDA's Office of Generic Drugs said to me, the approval process requires the ethical behavior of the applicant. Otherwise, the whole house of cards will fall down. He literally said that to me. So, wow, that's called a clue, that that something is really not right here.
So it depends. We're, assuming based on the face value that the manufacturer is doing everything that they could and should be doing, when in fact that's not the case. There was one really, you had a detailed chapter about one particular investigator. I think he might have been from North Carolina. He went out to India, and I think he came unannounced, something like that. You obviously know all the details. And people were running around when he showed up and grabbing thumb drives and printers and this, and it was just incredible. I mean, maybe we don't have to give away every detail because it's obviously in the book, but do you want to share that story? I think it was really interesting because this investigator was able to find within like a day all of the shenanigans that have occurred prior to that point.
Yeah. Well, the inspector you're talking about is Peter Baker, and he became a kind of genius at inspecting these plants. And the book actually opens with a scene in which he goes to one of these manufacturing plants, a sterile injectable plant in India, and there is an employee who's trying to smuggle out a garbage bag of records because he's there. And he asks the guy to stop, and the guy speeds up and he chases him down the hall. And the guy tries to discard the bag, and Baker opens it, and it's these torn records. And one of the things that the records show were these black particles in these vials of insulin, which were made in a secret part of the plant. And those records had been concealed from the FDA. And the records that were shared with the FDA showed a very different picture, that the drugs were fine. So in fact, what he discovered was secret manufacturing area, secretly concealed records, and contaminated drugs, all in one go. And unfortunately, that was fairly typical of what he was able to find in these plants.
So what sort of penalty is it for a generic manufacturer? Was that at the Ranbaxy? Was that what led?
No, that was a different company, but Ranbaxy was, I'd like to say that they were one of the worst offenders, but in fact, they were the company that just got caught. And they got caught because of the very heroic actions of an Indian senior official at Ranbaxy who ended up becoming a whistleblower. He really risked his life to alert the FDA that the company was massively fabricating quality data that it was then using to get these accelerated approvals from regulators. So he was able to blow the lid off of this fraud.
Wow, this is scary stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
part of what I think of this is a couple things like, obviously we want to just be healthy because then we don't have to rely upon, hopefully taking any drugs, right? But some people have genetic predispositions or environmental issues that are, so you have to take a medicine. And if you're on a medicine for perpetuity because of some health ailment, you want to lower the cost of that. So you're probably naturally going to go towards a generic. Now, some of these might be benign or they could be very problematic, like unsterile, like insulin, which could you imagine injecting that subcutaneous and getting infections in this? And the doctor might be like, because the doctors, bless their hearts, they're so busy in their practices, they don't probably know the information that you know about the backstory.
They don't, absolutely not. They definitely don't know. Yeah.
Which is yeah, I think you could probably go to Mass General or Mayo Clinic, have some sort of infection, get some antibiotics, and the physician or the nurse practitioner or PA who prescribes them could just say, just get the generic, it's the same, not knowing that. And you would think that if you're at Mass General or wherever, Mayo Clinic, that you go to the pharmacy, that it's going to be super high quality, but it could be like you talked about in your first book, it could be basically black market stuff, right? That makes its way into the pharmacy.
Well, yes, but the whole premise of our drug supply is that so long as the FDA has approved it, it is safe to take. And there is very little questioning of that basic premise. So nobody downstream is testing drugs, right? It's FDA approved, so it's all okay. But in fact, what you find when you really dig in is that there is a vast quality difference between different manufacturers, and that not all generic drugs are alike. Not all drugs are alike, but as one of my sources said, as a consumer, if you go out to buy cheddar cheese, you know the difference between Cheese Whiz, Kraft, and artisanal cheddar, right? Everybody gets that. And you understand that you get what you pay for. But if you go to CVS or let's say you go to Walmart and you pay $4 for a refill of a prescription, what you don't really understand as a consumer is that Walmart is, contracting with some of the lowest cost manufacturers, and you're getting essentially, rock bottom quality in that drug.
So, Catherine, along those lines, you were just at the vet this morning, and I think it's kind of interesting because the mode of which how you acquire drugs, after you see your physician is so different compared to how after your pet, after you see your pet. Oftentimes, the veterinary clinics have their own dispensaries, their own pharmacies. Is there the same challenge and problems with quality in terms of the vet space and things like that?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I would say that the quality issues are even greater there because the regulation is lesser. Wherever in same thing in the sort of supplement and nutritional world, which is, decreased regulation equals decreased quality. It's just that basic. When manufacturing plants are afraid of unannounced inspections, it drives compliance. And if they don't have that fear and they don't think anybody is looking, that is when consumers, in my view, are really at risk.
Mm-hmm. It's a great point. And having been on in the manufacturing side for supplements, there's always that risk that the FDA auditors, they come unannounced. And just because they're supposed to come every 2 years, they might come every 9 months. Like it doesn't, it just depends if someone's in the area. And so that's why, there was an impetus to make sure every batch record is signed to a T. There's no shortcuts. We're testing incoming raw materials, finished product, everything, because you never know. Now, some people are like, oh, our manufacturing plant is in the Vermont, let's just say way out in the middle of nowhere, Timbuktu, Idaho. So it was hard for investigators to get to. You would see those facilities kind of having some recalls periodically or challenges because they weren't getting auditors as much, or it would maybe be only in the summer because in the winter it's hard to get to. So it's a really interesting, point.
Yeah. So then try putting a manufacturing plant 7,000 miles away from FDA headquarters in Hyderabad. And the result, then you really have that problem.
Yeah, you can totally see how that would happen. Let's maybe get into, and I don't want to get too controversial about vaccines, but I think you probably thought about this, and I know because you contributed to that article in Vox, that, hey, look, Vanity Fair. Okay, yeah, sorry for botching that. So, great article, interesting thing to talk about. There are some stories that were referenced in that article where, because people need to wear sterile suits in manufacturing injectables, sometimes they would defecate and urinate in these suits and continue working. Can you share with us some insights?
Yeah. So this story that I did for Vanity Fair was about a Merck vaccine plant in North Carolina, where a whistleblower who worked there contacted the FDA because there were these insanely unsanitary practices going on in an aseptic plant. Workers, and particularly workers on the night shift, if they have to gown up to go into the sort of sterile area of the plant. And then in order to leave or to go to the bathroom, they have to degown, they have to ungown, and then to go back, they have to regown. So all of that takes a long time. And if you don't have really good supervision and, quality management, bad things start happening. So in this case, there were workers who were literally defecating in clean rooms in this plant, in their sterile uniforms. Totally staggering. So people ask me about the safety of the vaccine manufacturing, and my answer is, there's nothing particular about vaccines that are less safe than any other drug, but the safety issues are the same, which is how well are these plants being inspected? Are we seeing the documentation from these inspections? The answer with the COVID vaccines is actually we're not. They are not publicly releasing, as far as I know, the inspection reports. So, we don't really know what's going on, which is not to say that the vaccines are somehow fundamentally unsafe. That's not at all what I'm saying. This is not, I believe in science, I believe in vaccines. They're miraculous, but no drug is entirely exempt from the problems of how it's manufactured.
I mean, that's an excellent point, and I'm with you as well. We've been vaccinated, my daughter has. So questioning this stuff does not say that we're anti-vax, but if public health experts are, saying that this is a solution to end this pandemic, well, then let's see some transparency, because I was very curious. I went on Pfizer's website. I tried to search, like, are these things made in India or China, especially after reading your book, Bottle of Lies, because, there's reasons to question offshore manufacturing. And especially if we're pumping out hundreds of thousands, millions of these dosages, I mean, it would make sense that if you want to flood the market with this stuff, that you would delegate manufacturing. And that's where quality can come in. So that's got to, have you reached out to these companies? Has there been any transparency at all, when you did some research for that article?
So some, like the Moderna vaccine, is made through a contract manufacturer. The Pfizer vaccine, as I understand it, is being made at Pfizer plants in the US. But for sure, as this goes on, we're going to see much more manufacturing overseas. And, there, to inspect literally every biologic and vaccine plant that sells into the US market, the FDA has a team of 14 inspectors. That's it. Team Biologics. So my last story in Vanity Fair was about Team Biologics. It's 14 people. So you can get a sense of how overwhelmed this workforce is,
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And just travel, logistics, resources. Yeah, that's not that much. That's interesting. So Moderna they work with contract manufacturers. I didn't know that.
Moderna has never actually made a drug. They've never marketed a drug before. They don't have a track record. They haven't made a drug. They don't have manufacturing plants. So, they're outsourcing this to a company called Catalent, which has had problematic inspections previously. Like, the FDA has not been that happy with what it's found in Catalent manufacturing plants.
That's not good.
Yeah.
What would be suitable based upon, again, your 20-year experience investigating this industry? What would you like to see? I mean, batch records, transparency videos, like how could we be sure that something that we're injecting into our body is free of contaminants, doesn't have residual whatever, and actually has what we think or what we want, the therapeutic ingredients in it? What would you want?
So what you need is unannounced inspections by the FDA, by teams of inspectors. Those reports by those inspectors should be made public, and FDA bureaucrats should not be downgrading the findings of those investigators, which they routinely do. It's a big problem. So I would like to see the sort of the most rigorous and transparent inspectional process. That's what I think is needed. I also do have a bias towards manufacturing in the US, not because I think that other countries can't do it, but I think that there is something to the idea of people manufacturing for their own people in factories that are relatively close to headquarters of the FDA. I think it makes a difference. So that's what I'd like to see.
I'm with you. I mean, if we just create a parallel to food, this is why we like farm to table. The farm is over there. We know you drive by Uncle Joe's, beef farm, that he's, it's another thing if you just, oh, we're shipping these pigs to China, whatever, we can kick them or feed them, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? So yeah, that closeness, that proximity, I think does have some credence. And And I think that's great. And what kind of concerns me is because public perception about this vaccine in particular, confidence is not very high to begin with because of all the communication, changes and messaging and all that throughout this whole public health crisis. So if there were any quality qualms, so to speak, and those were revealed, that would just give you that would be a kind of an emotional withdrawal, and you'd be like, oh man, I have even less confidence in this. So it's kind of worrying some to me that we're not seeing some of the transparency, and maybe that's by design because they already know that confidence is quite low.
I don't know if it's by design, but there is a structural problem here. I've sort of likened it to, I don't know if you've read the book Fast Food Nation by Eric Schlosser, but if you read that book, which is kind of this just jaw-dropping expose of McDonald's and the food practices, you read that book and you can decide, wow, this is terrible, and I only want to eat organic food from small farms. There's something you can do about it. But it is really hard to say, wow, after reading Bottle of Lies, I only want to take drugs that are made in the USA from the best possible manufacturing plants. Consumers aren't given that choice. And really, I think when it comes to our pharmaceuticals, consumers need more choice. So imagine if you had country of origin labeling. Why don't we have that? Why doesn't you get your drug and it says, the active ingredients were made in China and the finished dose was put together in India? Why don't we have that so that companies that come along and say, hey, we're going to make it in the USA, that should be a selling point, and consumers should be able to have that choice. But that's not where we are at the moment.
That's a really good point. And there is some of that going on in the dietary supplement space where they will say, hey, all raw materials were of US origin or European origin or whatever. And then, American flag, for example, on that. But you do bring up a good point. And I think a lot of people have this perception that if this finished product was assembled in the US, it must have used European or materials made in the U.S., but it could have equally likely had materials made synthesized in India or China. Are those raw material creators suffering from the same quality control, lack of oversight as the actual manufacturers from what you've dug into?
Absolutely. It's the same inspectional system. And in fact, 80% of the active ingredient in all our drugs, whether brand or generic, come from overseas. So, as one person said to me, you can almost not make a drug without ingredients from overseas. It's just pervasive. So it's a big problem.
Mm-hmm. What about in Puerto Rico? I know there was a lot of manufacturing in Puerto Rico. Is that still going on? Were the problems the same, given that is sort of in the jurisdiction of the U.S.?
There were a lot of really well-run manufacturing plants in Puerto Rico that were well inspected and well run. I think that they've really taken a drubbing because of the hurricanes. So I'm not exactly sure where that's at now, but that was a kind of great solution. Lower cost manufacturing, but with the same high, regulatory oversight. So that was a good arrangement. And I think, given the state of the economy, it would be such a benefit to bring back manufacturing to the US. Those are lots of jobs.
Well, state of the economy, and then also the vulnerability of the supply chain is what happened in February and March, where there was back orders of pretty much everything from plastic bottles to toilet paper and all of that, right? So it's like if we're dependent upon this multinational symphony that shows that it's vulnerable and can be disrupted, why? Especially if you're on a bipolar medicine or something, if you are dependent upon a medicine to function, I would imagine that would be very frightening. Like if I had epilepsy and I had to take Dilantin or something to prevent seizures, just that knowing that you may not be able to get that medicine would be really frightening, I think. And it was for a lot of people that were really concerned about, the antidepressants and all that. Were there any categories of medicine that were really close to being completely out of stock from what you looked into?
Oh, absolutely. There were tremendous drug shortages. So early on, actually, a lot of the drugs needed for ventilated patients were in acute shortage in March, April, May. Fentanyl and other drugs that are required in order to be able to intubate, to ventilate patients were in serious short supply. Yeah.
Wow, that's wild. Well, Katherine, I really appreciate all the great work and the detail. I mean, you're such a good writer, and the amount of research and time to put the books that you've written together is just extraordinary. Are you working on anything else that we should know about?
So at the moment, I'm just full-time covering COVID-19 for Vanity Fair.
Okay.
And I'm active on Twitter, so people can follow me there at Katherine Eban, and check out my website, which is katherineeban.com. So I'm basically investigating the government's COVID response, and there's a lot of work to be done there, unfortunately.
Okay, so I did not know that about your history, which I think is phenomenal. Obviously, the government response has been largely politicized, and different parties are sticking their stake in the sand, saying we did this or we didn't do that. What I remember early on is there was a CDC. I'm sorry, there was an investigator here at University of Washington that was studying influenza that created an assay for SARS-CoV-2, but the FDA was really slow, or sorry, the CDC was really slow in getting back to them. What was up with that? Have you dug into that story?
Um, that story, that story has been very, very well covered. The response has been just terrible. The federal government response has been terrible. It's been basic things have been politicized. There has been sort of uncoordinated. One of the things that's so important in a public health emergency is consistent messaging, which has not happened. It's been all over the place. So, here we are, a country with so much scientific and medical might, and look at our response. It's among the worst in the world. We've lost so many people.
Right. Do you think, based upon the research that you've done, if the response early on was different, the outcome would have changed? And the reason why I asked that is there was a peer-reviewed article that came out using Red Cross data that looked at SARS-CoV-2 antibodies in the month of December of 2019. And it seemed that things were really seeded, So I'm just curious, like based upon that, would the outcomes be different in your estimation based upon what you've looked into?
Well, I think the single thing that the maybe the most consequential thing has been the failure to pass restrictive mask ordinances. Wearing a mask works. It protects the wearer, and it protects others. And mask wearing has been politicized. And you can clearly see in data that, places with, mask ordinances have had fewer casualties.
Mhm.
So that's a sort of big, big issue. And then frankly, not being straight with the American people about how serious this was, being consistent and clear about what a serious situation this was.
Yeah.
And here we are, over
Right.
300,000 fatalities. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's great. It's going to be interesting to see where this unfolds. Being that you're in Brooklyn, we've heard a lot about local businesses, restaurants. Last time I was in New York, it was November of 2019. You can go. We hear that a lot of people are leaving New York. How is the state of New York? Because you've lived there for so long. How is it compared to what it was pre-COVID?
It's just so hard to say. I am struck by the devastation to the economy, for starters. Just walking up and down the avenues and seeing so many empty storefronts, it's heartbreaking. All these small businesses that have just gone under. So they didn't get help. They couldn't survive. Um, so that's, on the very negative side. On the plus side, you see real adherence. So everybody wears a mask. Everyone wears a mask. And if you don't, you feel like you're doing something unsafe or you're not being neighborly and helping protect others. So that's good. But it's been devastating. Yeah, the blow to the economy is terrible.
Yeah, yeah, it has been tough. Are you guys locked down again, or is it kind of a partial thing? I don't know the current mandate.
Well, the schools are, it's really hybrid learning at this point. So the schools are not really, kids are getting schooled, but a lot of it is online. It's predominantly online. And I'm not sure if, I think indoor dining has ended.
Mhm.
So, there's all these, people
Pop-up
are eating,
tents.
yeah, pop-up tents, right? So, and which is nice, but it's getting a little cold. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
In Manhattan with the winds and everything like that going down the avenues and streets, it's like a tent.
Yeah, it's cold.
Yeah.
It's cold.
I understand the pop-up tents, but then part of me is like, okay, we're recreating an indoor environment that's ostensibly outside. I'm kind of scratching my head going, it is kind of interesting, right?
Right. Well, at what point does a tent become indoor dining? I mean,
Yeah.
that's a big question, which we don't know the answer to yet. Anyway, but
It makes it seem like you're doing something, and maybe that gives people confidence or whatever. It's interesting, but yeah, having gotten it by going to a friend's house for dinner, as much as I love going out to dinner, I think that's probably where most people are getting infected is by talking over food. The aerosolized particles. I mean, it makes the most sense, and that pains me to say because I think it's good for our connection to also be with people, and we know people are lonely and isolated. So it's this catch-22 situation. But
yeah.
yeah. Well, Katherine, keep up the great work. Thank you so much for all of your amazing detailed writing, and we'll make sure to put in the show notes links to your Twitter profile and some of the articles that you've recently written for Vanity Fair. And appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Thank you.